Okay, I had one more button to push and I have just pushed that. The webinar is now being recorded. At any time, please type your comments or questions in the questions pane in the GoToWebinar control panel on your control panel. All questions will be held and asked on your behalf at the end of the presentation. After the webinar is completed, it will be saved on our YouTube channel with members-only access. And I've typed a short welcome message in the chat panel to get you started, and we'll be posting links throughout the presentation that you may wish to use for follow-up. If you find today's session insightful, I encourage you and your colleagues to join us for the ongoing webinar series that both Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba are all presenting. Today, later at 12 Mountain Time, the Federal Floodplain Mapping Guideline Series version 1, Natural Resources Canada will present a brief overview of the revised Federal Floodplain Mapping Guideline. And on April 7th, Climate Change and Water Gauging the Uncertainty, Dave Soshin will present his work estimating 900 years of weekly river flows of the North Saskatchewan River at Edmonton and the South Saskatchewan at Medicine Hat. Ongoing webinars are on every branch's news sites. Go to cwra.org for more information or to sign up. Our presenter today is Patrick Pulak. Patrick graduated from the Civil Engineering program at the University of Manitoba in 1992, and shortly thereafter he was employed by the City of Brandon, where he remains to this day as Director of Engineering Services and Water Resources. He has spent 24 years involved in the utility side of the engineering department, overseeing service improvements and upgrades to both the water treatment facility and the water reclamation facility, the latter of which he will speak of today. With this, I'd like to welcome Patrick and hand the presentation over to him at this time.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. As Rick has alluded to, I will be talking about our water reclamation facility, which is a bit of a unique project for us, for the City of Brandon. We're a town of 50,000 people, so things aren't that exciting in the prairies in a town of 50,000 people. So when we have an opportunity to brag about some of the things we've done, it's always an opportunity for us. So let us begin. So just to give you an overview, in Brandon, prior to any upgrades, we had essentially 3 facilities in Brandon. We had our municipal wastewater treatment plant, which was essentially constructed in the early 90s to service just the needs of the City of Brandon. So any residents, commercial, industrial, that was the only facility at the time. Prior to that, the City of Brandon had lagoons, which we can see in the upper right-hand corner. Those lagoons were, up until the early 90s, were essentially the treatment process for the City of Brandon. Upon the construction of the municipal facility, they essentially became a stormwater overflow pond. We're licensed to discharge out of those out of the lagoons into the Assiniboine River. That ceased to exist again when we further upgraded our industrial wastewater plant. So the other facility you see on the map there is what we call our water reclamation facility. Prior to that, it was actually our industrial wastewater treatment plant. It was constructed in response to Maple Leaf coming to the City of Brandon. So we have a pork processing facility here in Brandon. It has the capacity to slaughter over 100,000 hogs per week. It's not at that capacity now, but originally when it came to town, if I recall correctly, they were in the close to 40,000 hogs per week range. And that facility, because of the uniqueness of the flow from the pork processing facility, we constructed an industrial wastewater plant. So just to kind of take a closer look at each of these facilities, our municipal wastewater treatment plant was a sequence batch reactor. It was an SBR. We had 2 reactors at the time, and I wasn't involved in this, but we did have a type of clarifier prior to the construction of the municipal wastewater treatment plant. They decided to try and recycle that infrastructure, and that's why you kind of, I don't know if you'll ever see an SBR shaped quite like this. It did raise problems. You have dead zones in your corners. I would say that that facility never really produced an effluent quality that we were satisfied with. Essentially, at that point, we were still using chlorine as a disinfectant. We move over to our lagoons. Essentially, we have 3 large lagoons. That fourth one that looks like there's a boat race on, that cell was dedicated to, at the time, it was Ayerst, which became Wyeth, which became Pfizer. In Brandon, we have a pharmaceutical company that produces Premarin from pregnant mare urine. And so what they do is they have contracts with farmers in the region who will, when their mares are pregnant, will collect that urine and send it to the facility here in Brandon, which then produces the base product for the drug Premarin. And any of that waste product would go into the cell 4, where it was aerated, discharged into cell 5, and then discharged to the river. Cell 3 was essentially the cell that the city of Brandon discharged, and then there was a pipe connecting 3 and 5. Those smaller cells you see in the corner, which we've since expanded, those are our biosolids cells. We still use them to this day. We discharge to one of those cells on an annual basis. We then isolate that cell for a year, and then we conduct a subsurface agricultural injection program for our biosolids. And so we cycle through these cells. We're now up to 3 cells. We've combined some of the smaller ones, but we're up to 3 cells. So 1 cell is always in use, one's in essentially the rest period, and the other one is just a backup. That we cycle through them on an annual basis. And then our original industrial wastewater treatment plant, we have Maple Leaf at the bottom there. Because of the fairly, substantially high BOD, an anaerobic basin was constructed. We collect the biogas off of that, and Maple Leaf, to a degree, uses that biogas in their cogeneration building. What they don't use, we flare off. It was this, and then from the effluent from the anaerobic basin, we go to our activated sludge process through a clarifier to the UV and then to the river. So essentially, just some background on the industrial plant. It was originally constructed just to provide BOD, TSS, and ammonia removal. There was no considerations for nutrients at that time. I threw this in, doesn't really mean much to me, but the process was configured as a modified Ludzak-Eminger process, which then provided about 50% of the total nitrogen removal. And yeah, I just threw that in there because when talking with one of our consultants, he thought that I should include this. Doesn't mean much to me. But anyway, come the early 2000s, for the people in Manitoba, we know that Lake Winnipeg has always been an issue with the eutrophication of Lake Winnipeg. The government at the time was concerned about the nutrients entering Lake Winnipeg. This is just a map showing the extent of the watershed for Lake Winnipeg. At that time, when they came out with what they call their nutrient effluent limits, or I more or less call it their nutrient management guidelines. So when they came out with this, they said that the effluent nitrogen, total nitrogen, has to be less than 15. And then effluent total phosphorus had to be less than 1. So at that point, we had some considerations to make, because as I've shown in the previous slides, we essentially are dealing with 3 industrial waste, or 3 waste streams in Brandon. We have the City of Brandon's waste stream, we have Pfizer's waste stream, and then we have Maple Leaf's waste stream as well. So the question is how do we achieve that? Do we achieve that independently of each other? Do we combine resources to try and achieve that? So that was a discussion that started taking place in about 2004, 2005. And really the question was there any synergies in forming this partnership? So, we conducted a couple of studies, and one of the things that it seems that each of the partner was lacking something that the other could provide. And so right off the bat, the one thing that, the city of Brandon had the volume of wastewater. Pfizer's waste stream is fairly concentrated. We could provide that dilution factor. On the other hand, Pfizer's waste stream is incredibly high in alkalinity, and that's something that Maple Leaf's waste stream was lacking. So there was the benefit that way. And then to complete the circle, one of the problems that we've always had, especially in springtime in Brandon, is the temperature of our influent. It can drop as low as, I've seen as low as 7 degrees Celsius, which at that point, any biological activity for the most part is pretty well non-existent in Brandon, especially with the way our SBRs were working. So Maple Leaf, in order to make the anaerobic basin, it operates at a temperature of about 30 to 34 degrees Celsius, has to preheat their influent, and that heat then comes through into the reactors and can help offset some of those temperature differentials we see in the springtime. So right off the bat, there was that synergy, and when we kind of worked it out, the numbers, we certainly saw that individually versus going on a partnership, there was about a 70% cost savings in forming a partnership and going forward and trying to achieve these nutrient guidelines. Problem is that each of us had our own timelines in regards to how we should achieve this. For Maple Leaf, we essentially, step back a bit, we essentially look at this upgrade in 3 phases. The phase 1 upgrade was really a business decision for Maple Leaf. They wanted to increase their hog production up to 74,000 hogs per week, and also include a provision for nutrient removal. So really the first phase 1 upgrade, which started in 2006 and was completed in 2007, was strictly beneficial to Maple Leaf, but it was still a partnership in the sense, and I'll get into that later, how that worked out, but essentially it still was a partnership, but Maple Leaf had to proceed on their own. Phase 2, sorry about that, phase 2 was completed in August of 2009, and was really 3 projects that were really, again, Maple Leaf was the driving force. They wanted to proceed to a hog kill rate of 90,000 hogs per week. At that point, we had to do some expansion to our lagoons. As I mentioned, you saw in the last picture, we have those 3 biosolids cells. We actually expanded that to, we still have 3 cells that are just larger in nature. We also went forward with adding membranes to help with our effluent quality. And then over at our municipal plant, one of the things that we've always, up until this point, any of our septage was going into a specialized, was essentially going into one of the biosolid cells at the lagoons. We changed that. We built a septage receiving station on our municipal plant. It actually gave us control over the quality of septage that we're getting in, and also to control where that waste was coming from, to gather that information so we can use it to determine if we were what our rates were going to be in the future. So then phase 3, which was then the complete build-out, was completed in 2013. This is really when all the partners came together and we were achieving everything we wanted to achieve. So both the municipal waste and the spent PMU from Pfizer were treated at, we now renamed it the Water Reclamation Facility. And essentially that waste stream was treated completely for nutrient removal and compliance with the Manitoba's nutrient management strategy. Towards the end, I'll show you some of the results that we're producing now. So what was the benefits of the upgrade and forming that partnership? And I think I've talked about this already. Is one of the things was that it was really attractive to the government, the fact that we were forming this partnership. So it was a corporate, civic partnership, and it really benefited us in being able to attract funding. So in phase 3 alone, we attracted $33 million in funding, which represented about 66% that cost of that phase. So we were looking at a cost of $47 million in phase 3. We received $33 million in funding, We went to membrane technology at that point, which at that time when it was commissioned was the largest of its kind in Canada and the 10th largest in the world. And people may wonder, why do you go to membranes if it really didn't form a crucial part of the process? For us, it was a conscious decision on the city of Brandon, and it was an economic development decision, is that we were going to proceed with trying to produce an effluent that we could recycle for existing or future industries. So right now, in industry comes to town, it's looking for a water source. And if it's appropriate, we can provide that as our effluent as that water source. It has the added benefit of preserving water capacity at our treatment plant, so that it can hold off those capital improvements for capacity at our water treatment plant if we can use this as recycled processed water. The expansion also allowed Brandon to meet its treatment needs into the year 2035. And in the end, after all that partnership, and there was capital contributions from this partnership, the city of Brandon was the sole owner of the facility with an investment of only $22 million. So from our council's point of view, who they're always concerned about money, it was quite a bargain for them. So let's talk just briefly about what each of the phases included. So at that point, when in the original photo, we only had one reactor. We moved to 2 bioreactors and included provisions for nutrient removal. So we have a pre- and post-anoxic zone. We are challenged for carbon in our process. We use methanol as that carbon source. And then for phosphorus removal, we went with chemical precipitation. So we added an alum storage building. In phase 2, again, this was in response to Maple Leaf wanting to proceed to a higher hog kill rate. We proceeded with the addition of membranes. And there was other components, like I was talking about. We did expand out the lagoons, and there was some small upgrade over our municipal facility. Then in phase 3, when we did install that original in the red, which is the original membrane building, we actually constructed it so that the wall could be removed and we could just add more membrane. So even though it shows that there's 2 buildings here, it is a single building. We now have 10 trains of membrane filters. We also, I don't think it shows it on here. It doesn't, but what it doesn't show is that there is storage facilities for spent PMU. So prior to the construction of this, Maple Leaf discharged all the spent PMU to the cell floor at the lagoons. It's now discharged to a holding tank. Okay, yeah, it's there. It's off to the very far right. Those are the holding tanks for spent PMU. So at this point, again, all 3 waste streams come together in a mixing zone. We have control over those waste streams so that we can keep the ratios at a proper ratio, that when we saw the benefits of those, that we're not overloading one with the other. So especially with the spent PMU, which is seasonal in nature, they only produce spent PMU over 4 months. But because of the concentrations within the spent PMU, we can't discharge it as quickly as we get it. Typically, it's discharged over a 6 to 7, maybe 8-month period, maybe longer. But within those, the operators can control the contributions from each of the partners. So from the city of Brandon, it comes from our municipal pre-treatment plant, which used to be our wastewater treatment plant. We now call it a pre-treatment because we had to essentially, there's no longer any treatment that takes place. It essentially has become a filtration facility. Because of the membranes, we're required to, we use rotating screens with a pore opening of 2.5 millimeters. And that's as per the recommendation from the supplier for the membranes. And that comes in through a separate pipe. Maple Leaf comes in from the anaerobic basin, and then Pfizer feeds in from the tanks. And we control those feed rates to keep the efficiency of the process as high as we can. So again, we talked about those membranes. This is some of the membranes we pull on a regular basis to do a cleaning, but that is what the operators that are standing on one train. We have 10 of those. They are a GE Z-weed membrane. We've had no issues with them, and in fact, we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary to look at start replacing some of those membranes. But our transmembrane pressures have been excellent, and there's no need to even to proceed with the replacement of those membranes quite yet. So they're exceeding their lifespan, and we're quite happy with that. They're certainly not cheap. This is the original membrane building. We've expanded on that. So like I said, in the initial construction, we made provisions in that one wall that we see to take that wall out and just keep on expanding the building. One of the reactors, or the initial reactor, which you see in the left-hand side here, is actually a mixer-style type reactor. It was aerated through essentially surface agitation. When we built reactor 2 in phase 2 and we constructed another reactor in phase 3, we went with fine air diffusion. Now, since this photo has been taken, we've actually converted that reactor number 1 to fine air diffusion as well. From an operational point of view, trying to keep everything consistent, it was a smart move to make on our part, and Manitoba Hydro actually partnered with us in help funding that project. So if I recall correctly, their funding was just about 40%. So again, another great opportunity for us to move forward, and the power savings are enormous. So again, we talked about those modifications to the municipal municipal plant, which again was just essentially we've gone from essentially a treatment facility to a pre-treatment facility, and for all purposes, it's just become a filtration facility. We do get some BOD removal because of that filtration, but that's about it. And the other thing it allows us to do is also then, as the flows come in, we've converted those SBRs to holding tanks. We can control the flows. We get a nice steady stream state going through the reactors over at our reclamation facility. And then again, some of the other parts that were included in phase 3, new discharge pipe to the river from the water reclamation, new force main from the municipal plant to the water reclamation facility, on-site storage for spent PMU. And then the other thing that we looked at was standby power considerations. What do we do in the event of a power outage? What we looked at, and one of the choices we had, do we look at a redundant power supply from hydro, or do we look at what would we require in the event of a power outage? What were our critical components? And that's kind of the option we've gone to in this upgrade. Was we essentially keep power to our critical components. We don't necessarily keep the process up and running, just because the way that our network, our power network is set up in Manitoba, they are able to, in the event of a power outage in one area, we're able to get fed from another area. So any power outage typically, and I've never seen one last for more than a few hours. So this was a decision we did based on our discussions with Manitoba Hydro. Just to talk briefly about some of the project costs, this is kind of the breakdown. When we formed this partnership, we entered into an agreement which we called our capital cost sharing agreement. And out of that came kind of what everybody's proportionate share would be. And then that was tentative too, based on any funding. Any funding we did get would be allocated based on your capital contribution to the project. So in the end, again, as I said, Brandon obtained that, took ownership of a facility that essentially cost us $76.9 million, with Pfizer kicking in 4.7 and Maple Leaf 12 million, and then receiving close to $38 million from the provincial and federal governments. Just to give you some sense of how operating costs have changed, because we've gone from essentially just a secondary treatment process to a tertiary process, nutrient removal. 2006, our operating budget was $730,000. We've since then, 2016, our operating budget was close to $2.3 million. And by far, the majority of that is chemical costs. So the chemical costs account for about 60% of our operating budget. Methanol by far is the largest cost that we have, followed by soda ash and coagulant. And we've certainly continued to investigate other areas of where we can reduce these costs. I know we could have used the ethanol from Minnedosa from the co-op facility up there, but the supply could never be guaranteed for us. And when you're operating a wastewater facility, consistency of supply is kind of pretty important. So, but we continue to try and find those efficiencies because, again, as that makes up the largest component of the operating budget, there's certainly opportunities for cost savings there. So I just want to talk a bit about how with the process, the changes in effluent quality we saw as a result of the upgrade. So I look back to after our phase 2 upgrade. Phase 3, we just continued have the same effluent quality. So effluent phosphorus, significant drop in it. You can kind of see we have a couple of blips there. That was as a result of commissioning the facility. You get the operators have gone from secondary treatment to tertiary treatment, required a bit of acclimatizing to the new process. But this has remained in effect. We rarely see any changes in our effluent, in our phosphorus effluent. We move over to effluent, the ammonia concentration, same thing. For all practical purposes, we're running well below 1. Nitrates and nitrites, we have, for the most, again, we get that. We're running well below that, our license limit of 15 milligrams. Well, I guess for total nitrogen. Bring that up, the next slide is for total nitrogen, certainly below that 15 milligrams per liter. In these days, again, as we're commissioning the facility, the operators are acclimatizing to using methanol and how we control our pre and post anoxic zones. So there's those blips in there, but when we do our monthly reports to our regulator here in Manitoba, certainly it's any exceedances of that limit are few and far between, and that is a rolling 7-day average limit too. That's not just at any one point in time. So when you tend to have an exceedance on one day, it tends to be over multiple days because of the rolling 7-day average. And then just to talk about some of the other things that we see in our effluent quality, I mean, because of the membranes, we essentially don't have to, we do have a UV system out at the water reclamation facility, but early on we were seeing that because of the filtration, our fecal and total coliforms or E. coli, like we're actually below the measurable limits from the lab. So one of the things is we work with our regulators, say, listen, we can keep the UV as a backup, but do we have to run it when we're producing this effluent quality? So at this point in time, we actually don't disinfect with UV. We run it through our membranes. We continue to monitor it. We've never had a single violation of our coliform limits. So TSS is less than detectable. Our BOD, then again, our nitrogen and phosphorus are well below our limit. In fact, in some ways, you almost, with the license limit being 50 in total nitrogen, the question is, should you be running it at 3, and you could be running it at 10, and maybe is there some cost savings? So those are the things that we continue to work with and try and get find those efficiencies in the process. So at this point in time, that is my presentation. I didn't want to get too detailed with any of the process details, but I certainly would take any questions if anybody has any.
Thank you, Patrick. Oops. Yeah, I am on. Thank you for your presentation. At this time, audience, please type any more questions or comments you might have. I'll give you a couple of moments to do that while I talk a little further about future webinars. A follow-up email containing a link to download the PDF file of today's slides Patrick, please send it to me. Will be distributed to all registrants in the coming days. As always, we appreciate your feedback. Our next webinar is actually tomorrow, well, later today, with the Federal Floodplain Mapping Guideline Series. It starts at 12 noon Alberta time today. And then there's another one on Wednesday, which will be the French version of the same guideline series. Then on April the 7th, Dave Sachin from the Prairie Adaptation Research Collaborative will be talking about future and past floods in the South Saskatchewan and North Saskatchewan rivers. The last 500 years of record that he has derived from the tree rings. And have one question at the moment. Are lagoons still in use?
They are, in Brandon, we still to a degree have combined sewers. I would say we're up to about 10% of our network is still combined. So when we do have fairly intense storm events in Brandon, it can create a large volume. Typically in Brandon at our municipal plant, we see 20 to 24 million liters a day. I've seen, because of the storm event in Brandon, as high as 90 million liters a day. When we get to that point in time, it's beyond our plant's capacity to handle that volume. So, yeah, for the lagoons, for the most part, we use them as a stormwater overflow, if that's what you want to call it. So when we get that above essentially 40 million liters a day, we're having to bypass some of that now to the lagoon. So it's used more for that purpose than what it was used for traditionally in the past. It's more related to stormwater than any extension of the treatment process.
Okay, a follow-up on that. Then do you then run that lagoon water back through the plant to treat it and continue the disposal?
Well, it's an interesting question. No, we don't return it back to the plant. There's another part to that I forgot to mention, but I'll discuss this after I answer the first part. No, we were licensed. We used to be licensed to discharge out of cell 5 to the river. We no longer have that ability to discharge. The volumes that we do send out to the lagoons are fairly insignificant. I'm going to say rarely do we have a storm event of sufficient magnitude that we have to go up to the lagoons. If anything, we've had to discharge effluent out there in order to maintain levels within those lagoons. Without us maintaining those levels, we can get a desiccation of the clay liner, and essentially then you could lead to breaches of the liner. And so we actually have to add some in order to kind of maintain the viability of the lagoons. That said, out of our lagoons used for biosolids, the supernate out of that is returned back to the facilities for treatment. So we do collect that and return it back. And in the end, when we go to do our biosolids program, we'll take as much of that supernate off and then do a biosolids program on the solids.
Okay. Any other follow-ups on that? That was a good explanation, Patrick. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So I don't have any further questions. And CWRA would really like to thank Patrick and Brandon for your time and contributions. And I'll thank everyone for attending today. And I hope to see, I have more questions. How was the lagoon affected by the flooding?
Well, thankfully, they are high enough that they are not affected by the flooding. We have at least 4 to 5 feet of freeboard still above the levels we saw in 2011 and 2014. So, and I would suggest that we would have to have a flood of biblical proportions in order to actually get that high up, just because there's so much spreading out of the river at that point to go up another foot at that point, you may have to double the flow. So, in my opinion, we are quite safe. We don't have any damages or impacts from flooding on the lagoons.
Okay. There was a slight nitrogen exceedance in the summer of 2008. Do you recall what was the cause of that?
It's again, our operators at that point in time had always been a secondary type treatment process. They moved to tertiary. Just the way we control our methanol addition. One of the things that was missing at that time was it never occurred to anybody that we had forgot to put a dosing meter on the methanol discharge at that time. We were essentially controlling the flow by almost by a bucket test, which is embarrassing enough. So here you got the operators learning a new process and then trying to control the flow on the methanol discharge. That's why you saw that blip, was them fooling around trying to find that sweet spot for them. It's just not just because of the cost, you just don't want to, I'm going to overdose and hope for the best. So that's why that blip is in there. It's really them trying to discover the sweet spot. We've since kind of rectified that problem, and you don't see it as often.
Okay, that sounds... I've got one more. Oh, no, it was the same one, repeated. Okay, and when we had that superstorm in the prairies, did that affect the lagoons seriously?
So it's a superstorm. We've had a
summer. the summer.
So we talk about back 2014 when we essentially had a system stall over Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and we had a flood, a record-breaking flood in the summer.
Yeah, and it wasn't because of the river.
Yeah, it did impact it because we do get some. There's no overland drainage that gets into it. It would have been strictly just precipitation levels. But we do operate those lagoons at a lower level. It's a balancing act between wanting to preserve capacity in there and still maintaining enough level in there that, again, like I said, you don't want to desiccate out the liner. So, really the only impact was through what we would have discharged as a result of the storm from the municipal plant. That's where we actually got up into those really high flows I was talking about. At that point, we actually had to bring in extra pumps because we couldn't even process it. Between what we could process and send out the lagoons, we just weren't keeping up. And we actually had to bring in extra pumps. So it was fairly short-lived because of the impact, because it was just a storm. It's not, it wasn't as a result of, say, snow runoff for that. So, yeah, the lagoons got full. In the end, if push comes to shove, we get so full, we had that discussion with the regulator. Could we discharge out of the lagoons in the event that an act of God fills them up so high, we're in the verge of overflowing them? And certainly that's something that they would, look upon favorably. So it's just a matter of we work with a regulator, always trying to keep them informed of any situation so that we're not, when we get into that position. But yeah, it did raise them up high enough that we started to have those discussions. We never did overflow them. We never did have to discharge from them. So,
but it became very worrisome.
Well, it did. You don't want to start overflowing them. Then you start getting into erosion, and then you can have a complete breach. So.
Yeah, and that would be worse. Okay. Any further questions? Oh, I do have a question. What happens to precipitated phosphorus?
That precipitated phosphorus is discharged into it becomes part of our biosolids. So it becomes part of our waste activated sludge that gets discharged out to our lagoons. One of the things that we had to conduct as a function of this upgrade was a sustainability study of our biosolids program, taking into account chemical precipitated phosphorus. So off the top of my head, I can't remember, and again, I'm not too much of a process guy, but it had to do with the way that the phosphorus was bound, and would it be ready available for in our biosolids program as a nutrient for the soil. But all I know is that when we did the study, we looked at all of those factors. We presented it to our regulator. Our biosolids program is part of our Environmental Act license, and at no point did we see any negative impacts as a result of going with chemical precipitated. Again, because at that point in time we were using alum, and we've since moved to ferric as a coagulant. The question is, would that impact impact our ability to meet the metal limits on our biosolids? And we certainly didn't see that. So.
Okay. That was fairly detailed questions we have. Thank you very much for your questions, all. And thank you again, Patrick, and the city for your presentation. It has been very useful for me to understand, and I hope for everyone else. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today, and have a great day. And we'll have the recording up on the members only portion of the website for others. And Patrick, if you send me your slides in PDF form, I will be circulating them to the attendees today.
I certainly will.
Thank you very much. Bye all.